All right, golfers, I want to film a video for everybody here regarding the shaft movement in the downswing. And what I want to do is I want to break apart some misconceptions that people have. I find that people don't necessarily understand what to look for as it relates to the club coming down into the golf ball. And so I'm going to provide some examples here of where really you should be looking if you're trying to improve the specific area, okay? So there are two things that are important as it relates to the club movement on the way down into the ball. There is the physical pitch of the shaft, which basically means is the club in a very upright or steep position coming down into the ball? Is it in a very horizontal or shallow position? Is it somewhere in between the two, right? And there is the directional movement coming into the golf ball. That's the second variable that we look at, meaning is the club in a state of shallowing, meaning it's progressively getting more and more horizontal coming down where the club head is dropping behind the body, or is the club steepening, which is the opposite? The club shaft is getting more and more upright coming down into the ball. You can see the club head is obviously staying very high. That's obviously the opposite direction, right? Well, depending on the matchup you have in your golf swing, sometimes the actual physical pitch of the shaft is going to be more important for you. And in other cases, the actual directional movement is going to be more important for you. What we're going to do is we're going to go over a couple of examples, and we're going to talk about how this relates to the actual rotational freedom a player creates in the golf swing. This is obviously something I've spoken about quite a bit. What that basically means is lining up the variables in a way that will allow the golfer the ability to rotate and still have a very functional strike and ball flight the way that they are intending, okay? And so when is the physical pitch of the shaft actually more important on the way down? Well, as a starting point, right off the bat, we're going to talk about shorter golf swings. Why shorter? Well, first of all, when we're talking about shorter swings, you can refer to that in a couple of ways. You can talk about if the arms aren't traveling very far back. Obviously, the longer back the arms travel, the longer the swing's going to get. If a swing stops very, very short, obviously it's considered a shorter swing. We can talk about if the club is not aligned parallel to the ground, then it's like obviously not a ton of wrist hinge. That would be considered a lot shorter in any of these cases, okay? Well, why is the physical pitch of the shaft more important for these shorter golf swings? That's the first question I get. Well, because you do not have the ability on a shorter swing to reroute the shaft enough that is required to get it into a good position so that you can still swing, relatively neutral into the ball, slightly from the inside, slightly from the outside or whatever, without creating extremes. Extremes are obviously a problem, right? Well, why is the physical pitch of the shaft more important for this player? Let's say you have a shorter golf swing, the arms aren't traveling very far back, we don't have a big turn, and the club is like very across the line. This is a nightmare scenario I see so often for golfers. Why is this a problem? Well, because the shorter the swing is, the less amount of time you have to reroute the shaft into a good position coming down so that you can swing from the inside of the golf ball or, like I said, relatively neutral into it, right? If my shaft is short and it's very, very across the line, well, the actual across the line positioning of this club, the physical pitch of the shaft in this area is actually the problem. Because I can directionally have the shaft actually trying to get shallow, meaning the directional movement of the shaft is obviously not an issue. The golfer's trying to work it the right way. But the problem is, if I'm super short and I'm very, very across the line, I don't have the ability to reroute the shaft fast enough. And so what ends up happening is even if it's trying to go the right direction, I might still be pretty steep late in the downswing because my swing was already pretty short to begin with. And now I'm either going to come down really steep on the ball and create all sorts of contact or ball flight problems, or I'm going to do something at the last second to try to prevent myself from being steep. And that usually comes in the form of some sort of compensation that creates like a block miss, hook miss, strike problems, and so on. In those situations, the directional movement is not the problem. It doesn't matter if the club's trying to get shallow or not. You don't have the time to get the club into a relatively good spot. And so what ends up happening is that golfer is doomed from the get-go. From the top of their backswing, they're likely going to struggle. Some golfers are going to get away with it. Outliers, of course, are always going to exist. You're going to have some golfers who are here and somehow can reroute it fast enough coming down to get into a good spot. But very few golfers have that ability. Especially in my experience as a coach, I don't see that happen very often. And so in this situation, we actually want the physical pitch of the shaft to be in a relatively shallow position from the get-go, because now you don't have the time to reroute anything coming down. You don't need to. Even if this club steepens a little bit coming down, right? Let's say it's like a little bit more laid off and it steepens a little bit coming down. It's not so problematic because the odds are it's not going to steepen a ton because you're going to get to the golf ball before it has the time to steepen enough to where it creates a problem. That's the way we need to think about it. And so if I have a shorter backswing, Well, I would want to have the club a little bit more laid off, because now, even if I don't reroute the shaft, I'm going to come down on a good plane. I'm not going to have so many issues. But if I'm short and I'm very across the line, the actual physical pitch of the shaft here is the problem. It doesn't matter if the club directionally is going the right way. That's something that people need to understand. So depending on the length of swing you have, you need to look at where that club is actually aligned. It makes a massive difference, right? If your swing gets longer, it's far less problematic, right? Because I can have a much longer golf swing, and if my club is in that same across the line position, it's not nearly as troublesome. The reason being is because now I have so much time before I get to the golf ball, double the length of that prior example I showed you, where even if it is quite a bit across the line, I can reroute the shaft. Now, directionally, the club is more important here, right? We don't want to just come crashing down on the golf ball that way. But if the club is trying to get shallow, even if it's not shallow right away, it's going the right direction. So by the time I get later in the golf swing, I'm likely to get into a relatively good shallow spot so that my body can still turn into the golf ball and create a good strike. So the longer the swing gets, the less important it is for the club to be in an automatically shallow position. In fact, when a swing gets very, very long, the physical pitch of the shaft is still very important, but for an entirely different reason. If your swing gets very, very long, right, and your club now gets very, very shallow, very laid off at the top, well, now it gets really hard to keep the club in a shallow position. Directionally, I cannot get this club shallowing out. It's likely going to go the other way. Well, when the swing is longer and you're too laid off, now as you start down, the club is going to steepen a little bit. Well, it's likely going to keep steepening until you get to the golf ball. So what I see happen quite a bit with these players is if you set the club too laid off with a longer swing, it's not just going to steepen a little bit, it's going to steepen a lot, right? That shorter golf swing that I spoke about in scenario one, if my club is on the laid off side, but I'm very short, even if it steepens a little bit, it's not going to steepen so much by the time you get to the golf ball. The club will be on a relatively decent plane coming into it. But when the swing gets longer, it has more time to steepen, right? And so if that shaft is poorly aligned too shallow, now it's not just going to steepen a little bit. It's going to keep steepening until I get to the golf ball. I might have that club end up so far out in front of my body in the downswing, I'm going to cut way across this golf ball. Now, again, the physical pitch of the shaft is important, but we want a different preference. Now on a longer swing, we don't necessarily mind if it takes us longer to get the club in a shallow spot because we have the benefit of time. The swing is longer. And so in a situation like that, if my club is a little bit more across the line, it's far less problematic. I can actually shallow out the club as much as I need in terms of time to get it into a good spot. When my swing is very short, well, if I'm here, even if my club is directionally going the correct way, well, I don't have the time to shallow it enough. I'm going to get stuck here and then either jump or shallow it really late, which gets me stuck too far from the inside and it creates other problems in other areas. So I just wanted to clarify, like, as it relates to the physical pitch of the shaft, it is very important for some golfers, and depending on the length of swing you have, it becomes even more important, right? That's something to consider. There is a range of acceptable areas where it's not so problematic. Like if the club is just a little bit across the line, or if it's just a little bit laid off, you still have space to shallow the club here. And if you're here, you can probably still get it into a shallow position soon enough. So if there is like an acceptable range I give people, it's always like slightly across to slightly laid off is not so problematic. But if we're talking extremes, well, if you're going to be extremely laid off, you better have a very, very short golf swing. And if you're going to be extremely across the line, you better have a little bit of a longer backswing. Longer doesn't necessarily mean club parallel to the ground. Longer means maybe more hip turn. It means a longer arc to the hands and so on. But the longer the swing gets, the less we want that thing being too laid off. The shorter the swing is, the less time we have to shallow it, even if directionally it's going the right way. And obviously we want that club to be in a relatively shallow position to begin with on a shorter golf swing. So that's where like the physical pitch of the shaft actually comes into play.